Hello, I'm Scott Mathias, and this is Beyond the Noise. I'm talking to a gentleman called Richard Hames, who's been described by Forbes as one of the smartest people on the planet. He's an entrepreneur, a strategic futurist, and an author. He's mentored heads of states and is continuing to do that, as well as corporate leaders. He warned of the probability of attacks on the World Trade Center, the GFC, the crash in 2008, amongst other things. He also warned or even predicted that Donald Trump would become president of the United States. Richard Hames, thank you for joining us. You're in Australia and you're about to begin a series of talks. Tell me, why are you here and what are you hoping to achieve?
Well, I'm Australian, and a lot of my family, my children live in Australia still, although I live in Thailand. What I'm hoping to achieve is to initiate or contribute to a deeper conversation about many of the existential problems facing humanity and how we at a local level can do a lot if we're prepared to jettison the old kind of thinking and emotional reaction to those issues.
Now, you mentioned old ways of thinking and emotional reaction to those issues. Is the solution for humanity, and I really wanted to ask you a direct question, can humanity save itself here? And is the solution in history, or is the solution somewhere else that we haven't touched yet?
Oh, that's a good question, Scott. Yes, I believe humanity can save itself, but there are some provisos. I think the thing holding us back at the moment, and it's global, it's nowhere in particular, and it's global, is the kind of gridlock that we're in intellectually and in terms of decision making. We seem to have reached a threshold that we can't break through in terms of stepping into new epistemologies and looking at design through new design ontologies, if you like, to see things really afresh and to let go of the personal interest that dominates the kind of thinking at the moment in terms of the economy particularly, and to try and cooperate more fully with everybody else. And those things are very difficult for us to do, and I think they're necessary if we're to save ourselves.
You have already begun talking to the media in Australia, and the media globally is of course taking a lot of flack at the moment with regard to the authenticity and the virtue of the news, commentary and opinion that they are actually bringing forth.
Yeah.
What advice can you give to the average citizen in the street in terms of the onslaught of this media? How should they be handling it? How should we be handling this at this particular time in regards to this issue of choices, personal choices?
Yeah, I think one of the things to do is to possibly ignore a lot of what goes on in the corporate media and in social media. With corporate media, you have the influence of individuals on what is said and how it's said, how it's presented. And those media present an ideological perspective that is increasingly obsolete, but it actually generates outrage, fear and hatred and division. And so I would ignore most of what goes on in the corporate media. With the social media, that's a different thing altogether, in that you can never know the truth from, or tell the truth from what is false or not. And you tend, if you're on Facebook or you're on Twitter or any of these, or Instagram or any of those platforms, you tend to get fed what the platform knows you want to hear. And so it simply reinforces any view that you might have and actually entrenches it further into your mind. So my advice in terms of understanding what is going on in the world is to try and divorce yourself from those conventional forms of media, and through your own network, your own purposeful network, triangulate information and ask people, what's going on? How do you see it? What is your perspective on things? Why do you think like that?
It's very interesting. This whole issue of subjugation to ideologies and subscription to belief systems, consensual belief systems. When you talk to your heads of states and your corporate leaders, who by virtue of the power that they hold and the money that they have behind the PR machine and things like that, what are you telling them these days?
Well, it's not so much telling as trying to give them insights as to alternatives. The overwhelming emotional and psychological factor they're dealing with, most of them, which they will never admit openly, of course, because it opens their fragility and vulnerability, which they're not supposed to have as leaders, is the alternatives to the current world system. Let me just step back a bit. The world system that we're dealing with every day in terms of how we live our lives all over the world, differently, of course, and what goes on, is fashioned and shaped by a shared worldview. Now, increasingly, over the past 50 years, that worldview, or let's call it a belief system, has been shaped by Western cosmology, scientific realism, Cartesian thought, that notion of dualism, right, left, right, wrong, black, white, and capitalism as we've practiced it.
Yeah.
And almost every culture and country in the world now aspires to that Western paradigm. Now, it so happens that it's not the only worldview that exists. There are many different worldviews, but that worldview is dominant. It prevails at the moment, and even the poorest developing nations seem to aspire to that Western model of progress and success. The reality is that is a very toxic worldview, and it's led to a great deal of harm. It's led to conflict. It's led to malnutrition and industrial forms of practice that, you know, in terms of agriculture and food, is damaging to human beings. It's also damaging to other species, as is exemplified at the moment by the loss of biodiversity across the planet. So what I try and encourage leaders to do is what I call stepping into a new epistemology where alternative worldviews or belief systems become possible, depending on their intentions and what it is they're trying to achieve. All of those things are colored by our individual cultural mindsets. A mindset is very different from a worldview. The worldview is global and shared, whereas the mindset, your mindset, is different from mine. You know, we're all different. But it's our interpretation of the shared worldview that is becoming so homogenous at the moment that we can't seem to think of alternatives. So that's my work with leaders, to try and open a window on the world that is different.
How much does fear play in your filtering process? See, on a domestic level, we have a tremendous amount of confusion. From my field of interest at the moment is health and nutrition, health and wellness. And from an integrated point of view, what you're sharing actually from an external perspective often determines what the body reacts, how the body reacts, and any disease or issues arising from stress, fear, and things like that will impact on it. When you're talking to these people of power as such, do you address issues like, you know, there is a fear factor in the community at the moment. How can we turn that around? How can we provide a level of comfort through dialogue, through narrative, through PR, whatever? Is that something that you want to talk more about in relation to your visit here to Australia and your ongoing work with world leaders?
Yes, it's inevitable, and it's fear in many dimensions and on different levels. There's certainly a lot of world leaders are fearful themselves of what they know is happening and yet seem powerless to do anything about as individuals. But then, on the other hand, you have governments or administrations who are deliberately using fear as a tool to provoke division, or not necessarily to provoke division, but to say, look, we need to take away your freedoms to some extent in order to protect you. And certainly at the moment, that's what I see with the Australian government, a greater degree of surveillance. And because of that, we're most likely to see more social activism, especially from women and children, as we're seeing all around the world. And we're likely to see more disengagement of the community from the political process, which is not a good thing. And we're likely to see more civil disobedience, even in a country like ours.
That's an interesting comment. You see the rise of veganism, okay, this whole food, plant-based approach to life, where people are being led by a couple of things. In my particular case, it was very much health related, and then the ethical issues rose out of that. And I came from a meat industry family in New Zealand, and I've seen this stuff firsthand. And looking back on it now, how I endured it, I don't know. But we're seeing just a massive growth philosophically and ethically in this particular area of what I refer to as day-to-day moral virtue. Are we going to see this sort of thing increase more and more? I mean, you see truthers now say, I only want the truth, but what the hell is the truth, as you've just mentioned? But is this the form of social activism you are referring to?
Partly, yes. Certainly the moral conscience of the community is shifting. And in terms of your field of interest, that's very interesting, because there's an obvious shift away from red meat in one's diet. And there are good medical reasons for why we should eat less red meat. But there's also a confusion about how damaging cattle and animals are generally to the environment. There are assumptions made that cattle are bad and therefore we should eat more plant-based material. That actually is not exactly correct. The scientific fact is that we're managing the resources on the land in ways that are harmful and toxic. And industrial agriculture is the problem. If we move to a more organic way of managing our resources, then the ethical concerns probably wouldn't be as much, and we would naturally probably eat less red meat anyway. So it's complicated. There's a whole range of issues that impact on one's decision to be vegan or vegetarian or to eat some fish or whatever you eat. But the fact is that a lot of the food, indeed the water, that we eat and drink at the moment is contaminated in one way or another. And that is presenting us with huge problems.
And even in Australia, I was originally born in New Zealand, and of course it was the land of plenty and everything is clean green. But of course they've got major runoff issues with the dairy industry over there. You know, 90% of the waterways in New Zealand are in fact uninhabitable. You know, they're seeing a decline in fish habitat and other waterborne insects and things like that. Will the planet, in fact, determine the fate of humanity here? Let's just step forward a little bit and say, okay, there's choices that humans can make, but will the choices, or is this a possibility that the choice for change may be taken away from humans and the planet will decide?
Yes, this is a matter of timing, I think. What I believe is fairly obvious, and a lot of people disagree with this, is that if we don't make the right decisions within the next decade, or perhaps at the outside two, then by the turn of the next century, the human population could collapse to about 1.5 billion. We're at 7.7 billion today. So we need to make the right choices, make the right decisions. And if we don't do that, I think the planet, yes, it will do it for us, and will be virtually eliminated as a species. No two ways about that, I think.
Message for the Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison. If he was sitting in front of you right now, what would you like to share with him?
What I would want to share with him, actually, I would want to workshop an experience of transformation with him and the cabinet. What I would want to do is to look, to get them to look closely at what they believe at the moment. And I would want to go through a process of deconstructing those beliefs, injecting a different kind of strategic intelligence into their conversations so that they could talk from different positions and feel differently about certain things. Because the thing that worries me at the moment is ideologically driven thinking or beliefs are obsolete. They're not able to deal with the complexity of life today. I would then try to reconstruct a new belief system for them and with them that gave them many more options in terms of designing policy, and that would enable them to come up with policies that work for everyone, not just a particular group of people. What disturbs me most, I guess, is that the systems, the most life-critical systems that we designed perhaps a century or more ago, we still use and are no longer functioning as intended. And as a consequence, they no longer work for humanity as a whole. So the human family is suffering. What we need to do, and what I would take the Prime Minister and the Cabinet through, is a process where they set aside everything they have thought until now and believed until now, gone back to first principles, and used their good intentions and their intelligence and their positions to say, okay, let's try and imagine and design something much better than what we have.
That takes a tremendous amount of courage. How do you, I mean, we could talk about this all day, but you know, I'm just, these guys will look at you and go, oh my God, we've got to summon up courage and start to think laterally and remove all our conditioned belief systems in order to actually find a direction forward, in order to avoid the social unrest that you spoke about, in order to avoid the activism that you spoke about. I certainly would, if I was in his position, to be open to any support that you could provide. Don't want to delve too much into this, but would you be offering the same sort of response or the same sort of advice to the President of the United States, for instance?
That's a bit tricky. In dealing with psychopaths and sociopaths, there is territory you actually can't go into because it doesn't make any difference.
Right.
So in terms of the US, what I would be wanting to do would be to identify those people who are critically influential, that are open-minded enough to go through that transformational process and work with them instead. And I'm not just thinking of the current administration as being difficult. Wherever you see a more extreme fundamentalist ideological point of view, you have far greater difficulty in getting through to the individual, or the purity of the individual. But can I just recap for 1 minute, because it's not simply courage. What these people lack is a sophisticated and viable alternative toolkit to use to actually shape their thinking better. They don't have that. These tools and processes and methods do exist, but they don't use them. They avoid them and just fall into the trap. And it's a prison of our own invention, that we fall into the trap of just thinking and doing and being the way we are, and believing that we are here in this position as a minister or a prime minister because of that, rather than because we might have imagination and creativity and the impulse to collaborate with others that would define a different kind of future.
Brilliant.
So in other words, not constantly patching up the past or patching up the present, but actually imagining a different future.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, I can see that you're a thinker. I love your mind. I would like to talk more about this in the months to come. One final question, 1 minute. What message do you have for humanity?
The message for humanity is really, it's one thing. Let's set aside division, fear and hatred of the other, and agree that the more important goal is the preservation of the human family as a species. And let's all work towards that. Let's set aside all the trivial stuff and the minor problems and work towards a society globally that prospers and thrives in cooperation and empathy with each other.
Absolutely fantastic. Richard Hames, thank you so much indeed for joining us. richardhames.com. Anything else you'd like to add with regard to books, or can members of the public access you, or are you just focusing on the strategic work with world leaders and important people?
No. In fact, quite the opposite. The Center for the Future, which I founded 4 years ago, which started working on global projects, kind of things like reinventing democracy, which actually isn't working anywhere in the world, which is on a slow burn, and you'll see the impact of that at the next election in Australia. And another one, for example, Operation Peace Quest, which is designed to persuade, the idea is to repurpose the military to wage peace rather than war. So big things like that. But we're now entering a phase where we want to create leadership development programs for young people, particularly, to counter the old notion of what leadership is and the results that those people get from thinking that way.
Almost like preparing a pathway for these new generations who, of course, will, as meekly as they may or may not be, will inherit the earth. Richard Hames, thank you so much indeed. richardhames.com. Thank you for joining us today, and all the very, very best on getting into the heads and hearts of people globally, but more importantly, in these near times, the Australian population. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you, Scott.
I'm Scott Mathias, and this is Beyond the Noise.